Hi, Dal. Not really so strange, just strange for us.
Close the door for a moment.
Okay, thanks. Hi, folks. How you doing today? It was another eventful day in many cities. It looks like the police are having a field day. And it looks like they're doing it with the support, either tacit or semi-explicit, of many of the governors, and explicit, okay, with many of the mayors in America. Okay, I'm going to read my write-up for this stream. Well, by the way, please share. I know some of you are returning from a Joy Man interview with one of the VP candidates for the Green Party, specifically the one selected by Howie Hawkins. And I'm curious about her. I'm going to ask you about her a little later. But for now, the protests against the murder of George Floyd have brought American citizens face to face with another huge issue: systematic the denial of basic rights guaranteed to all Americans by the Constitution. These are the rights of free speech and the free assembly and free press, three essential rights constituting the foundation of all our other rights and democracy itself. Does our government respect those rights? Do our police and courts respect these rights? Are those in authority violating their oaths to the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution? Are we living in tyranny? These are the questions that I want to consider here tonight. So I'm going to do it partly through the lens of some articles, but I'm also going to have a lot to say as we go along tonight. Okay, so here we are. I'll take a few of your comments now and go into more of them later. Dale says, good evening, Doc. Strange times. Wherein? And my reply to that is not really so strange for many nations, but certainly strange for the United States. And Dolores says, hi all, and sharing. Amber Lee says, hello, my lovelies. Hi, Amber. Nice to see you. And Lana greets everyone and asks everyone to share. Thank you, Lana. Steve says hi. Gina Marie says hi. Avril says hi. Lana states one of the themes of the evening, the police are out of control. Lana says, I didn't see Joy. Maybe she's running late. Kay says, hi all, was listening to a Zoom call for the Movement for a People's Party. I hope that was a good call. The People's Party really has to get organized now as quickly as possible. I don't think they have enough time to really get organized for the fall, and that's unfortunate because I think we really need them. Avril says, still in the hospital, still winning against patient dumping. That's really great news, Carmen. How are you feeling tonight? Hope you're feeling better. Okay, give me a minute. I'll give my computer a minute. It's ticking. A little bit of time to respond to commands. There we go. I'm going to start off with a piece from Jacobin, from Megan Day. It's quite a good piece. And the title of it is, in cities and towns across the U.S. this week, the brutal police riot has continued. That is certainly the truth. And Megan starts, on Monday, I published an article compiling dozens of instances of police violence against demonstrators protesting police violence. The major media outlets are not covering the breadth of the police violence against protesters. Often they speak in generalities about tensions and clashes before inevitably lapsing into commentary on the occasional degree of looting and arson that has accompanied the civil unrest. That means the most reliable source for information on what has actually transpired between protesters and the police is user-generated video that circulates on social media. The volume of these videos is overwhelming, and there's no centralized place to find them all. Consequently, as exhaustive as my list was, I missed some particularly egregious acts of brutality by the police that occurred last weekend. For example, in Austin, a young black man named Justin Howell was filming the protests on his phone when a protester beside him threw a water bottle and a backpack at police. The police fired back with less with they fired back with some less lethal projectiles, quote unquote, one of which struck Howell in the head, fracturing his skull. When fellow protesters picked up his body and began to carry it to safety, the police shot at them too, injuring one of the medics. Howell's older brother says that he has sustained brain damage. At the same protest, the police hit a teenage boy in the head with a rubber bullet. The police riots continued throughout the week. Below is another list of most recent incidents. So this is after her Monday list. But once again, it's incomplete. But again, it demonstrates clearly we are witnessing a gigantic paroxysm of police violence. Viewed together, it's clear that what follows is not a string of miscalculations. On the contrary, direct aggression, not diplomacy or de-escalation, appears to be police department's general strategy for responding to the protests. That is to say, folks, for responding to the exercise of the rights of free speech, free press, and free assembly by the public. Under the heading of lawless law enforcement, continue with Megan's article, in Asheville, police in full riot gear stormed a medical tent. They battered the medics with shields and threw several medics to the ground. The medics say the tent had been approved by the city and that they were not resisting as police physically assaulted them and bizarrely stabbed water bottles, leaving them crumpled and empty on the ground. In Richmond, a police officer repeatedly spat on a protester who was sitting, fully restrained and motionless. In Philadelphia, a police officer pulled down a protester's mask to pepper spray her in the face. In Charleston, they arrested a peaceful protester simply for delivering an emotional speech. Police in Kansas City, the exercise of free speech, by the way, police in Kansas City did the same thing. In both of these instances, the protesters were young black men. In Milwaukee, the police rushed with their batons and arrested a well-known Black Lives Matter activist. In Denver, the police shot projectiles at and injured a black member of the Use of Force Committee who had met with the police department hours earlier. So they must have known who he was, right? In New York City, police pepper sprayed and arrested a black state senator, Zelnor Myrie. In Portland, Oregon, a police vehicle drove recklessly and aggressively down a street people were attempting to clean. In Boston, police drove a car into a peaceful crowd at a dangerous speed. In New York City, police trapped nearly 5,000 protesters on the Manhattan Bridge for several hours while digital billboards atop skyscrapers broadcasted tweets from Governor Andrew Cuomo reading, quote, "Do not be a criminal," unquote. "Do not be a criminal like the police," and, quote, "help me restore calm," unquote. In Walnut Creek, California, soldiers and tanks threaten, quote, "If you do not move, you will be dead," unquote. Across the country, journalists were targeted by police despite being visibly marked and verbally identifying themselves as press. In New York City, journalists were shoved and pinned against cars in retaliation for breaking the city's curfew. When they explained they were exempt from the curfew, an officer said, quote, "Get the fuck out of here, you piece of shit," unquote. In Washington, D.C., police were caught on video physically assaulting members of the press. In Seattle, an alarming video showed an NBC anchor and other members of the press corps fleeing exploding projectiles in an environment resembling a war zone. In Des Moines, police pepper sprayed a journalist as she said, "I'm press, I'm press." I'm press, I'm with the Des Moines the Register, I'm going, unquote. In Cincinnati, police took a bag from a diabetic protester and refused to return it to her when she pled for her insulin. In Seattle, a police officer approached a completely calm pedestrian and attacked him unprovoked, choking him and pinning him to the ground. In Hoover, Alabama, 50 police showed up in full riot gear to confront 14 high school students sitting on the lawn of their campus with signs. In Oakland, police used tear gas and flash grenades on a youth-led peaceful protest that occurred in broad daylight. In Washington, D.C., a child picked up an unexploded sting ball grenade to the horror of her father. It could have killed the child if it had detonated. In Buffalo, police brutally attacked and arrested a protester who was giving an on-air interview to the press. In Kalamazoo, Michigan, police shot tear gas at protesters who were laying on the ground entirely motionless. In Salt Lake City, police shot protesters with projectiles at point-blank range. In St. Johnsbury, Vermont, police threw a woman down a flight of stairs. In Los Angeles, police fired the projectiles at people who were simply standing still and having a conversation. In Des Moines, police used pepper spray in an elevator. One of the women in the elevator screamed, "Please don't, I have a baby." In Atlanta, police arrested a black woman and kept her in jail for 14 hours because she violated curfew by going to the store to get the tampons. In Chicago, 2 black women running errands in their vehicle were rushed by a dozen armed officers, dragged from their parked car, thrown to the ground, and pinned down with knees to the neck. One of the women was injured by shattered glass and detained. Police seized the car. In New York City, police forced a woman to turn over the keys to her car because she honked in support of the protesters. In Los Angeles, police blocked random intersections and began arbitrarily breaking windows and dragging motorists from their cars before arresting them for violating the city's curfew. Los Angeles police also sprayed rubber bullets at teenagers in drive-by shootings. An LAPD officer was overheard on a police radio saying, quote, "You should not be driving past anyone. Stop where you are and take someone into custody, unquote. In Philadelphia, a video circulated showing a police officer forcing a stick into a black man's hand while the man was pinned to the ground, creating the impression that the man was brandishing a weapon before other police officers were called over to further restrain him. Also in Philadelphia, police pushed protesters who had occupied a highway onto a fenced-off hill on the side of the road and then fired tear gas indiscriminately at the trapped crowd. Tear gas is theoretically meant to disperse protesters, but there was nowhere for the protesters to go. By the way, I don't think tear gas is meant to disperse people who are protesting through exercising their constitutionally protected free speech. They're not supposed to be dispersed. That is freedom of assembly. Dispersing them is a violation of freedom of assembly. Tear gas is theoretically meant to disperse people who are rioters, or people who are committing crimes, or people who are involved in an insurrection, but not people who are exercising their rights of free speech and free assembly. Anyway, to finish the sentence, but there was nowhere for the protesters to go. The cops were tear gassing people who had nowhere to go, so they couldn't be dispersed. The tear gas, in other words, were being dispensed as an illegal form of punishment of the protesters, without trial, without standing trial, without going to court, without any decision by a judge who would not be sentencing them to tear gassing anyway. The police decide to act as the executioners and to tear gas people. In New Orleans, police nearly caused a stampede when they tear gassed protesters marching on an expressway. In Huntsville, Alabama, police admitted to using tear gas on peaceful protesters because they didn't want to, quote, roll the dice, unquote, that the protests would turn violent. There's no dice there. The protests across the country have not turned violent against the police. Any violence that there's been in the protests has been in connection with spin-offs to looting, which have not been coming from the protesters, but from looters separate from the protests. All the protests have been predominantly extremely peaceful. Reporter after reporter says that. All the evidence we have says that. There's an extremely low probability that protests of this kind are going to turn violent because people were being very careful. You know, it wasn't a matter of rolling the dice, or taking a chance. It was a matter of wanting to do violence against the protesters. In Fargo, North Dakota, the police chief apologized after he was busted pretending to be a violent protester and instigating conflict, holding a beer can and cursing at law enforcement. The police chief, did he think nobody was going to recognize him? In Orlando, police boxed in peaceful protesters before the curfew had begun, rendering all of them arrestable for violating curfew. Catch 22 right in Orlando. In New York City, police stole protesters' bikes while also telling them they needed to go home because of curfew. And they also beat people as they were attempting to go home. In Washington, D.C., police confronted non-protesters who were waiting in line to vote. It was election day. The curfew was not meant to apply to voters, but police illegally ordered them to disperse anyway, rendering them unable to vote, depriving them of their right to vote, in other words. In Chicago, the police broke a protester's wrist with zip ties. In Santa Monica, After 7 hours of detaining protesters with no food or bathroom, the police lacerated a woman's hand as they carelessly and aggressively used a knife to cut the zip tie they had used to restrain her. Quote, I could see my bone and my flesh was falling off, unquote, she said on social media. Quote again, the police sat there and did nothing to help me but called the fire department, unquote. In New York City, a hospital worker who was coming home from the front lines of the COVID-19 crisis when police attacked him and beat him so badly that he needed staples in his head. White vigilante allies is the next section. In other words, what's going on is in some areas, the police are actually instigating civil war. In Columbus, a 21-year-old protester died. Her family has apparently asked that her name be withheld and is still awaiting autopsy results. But social media posts indicate that people who knew her believed she died from complications arising from the inhalation of tear gas. In Asheville, Philadelphia, Chicago, and elsewhere, white men with automatic weapons and baseball bats walked the streets unharassed by the police. Yes, they only go after unarmed protesters, peaceful protesters. As long as you're armed, as long as you're white, as long as you have automatic weapons and baseball bats, you're okay. In Crown Point, Indiana, police watched on the sidelines as a crowd of over a dozen white people, 8 of them armed with machine guns, but menaced passing protesters. In Chicago, police sat by as white men with bats wandered around looking for protesters to confront. In Orange County, California, police were spotted wearing right-wing militia patches on their uniform. In Philadelphia, the police calmly asked a roving gang of white vigilantes to disperse and then allegedly arrested a black man who'd been the target of a flying baseball bat from their ranks. Later, a video emerged showing Philadelphia police posing with the white vigilantes for group photographs. In Oakdale, California, a group of white counter-demonstrators with Trump and pro-police flags physically assaulted a black Lives Matter protester. The incident resulted in the police riding their horses into the crowd of Black Lives Matter protesters and attacking them on the ground with the batons. The police permissiveness and friendliness towards armed white vigilantes and groups they consider allies underscores the extent to which the police view themselves not as guardians of public safety, but as anti-protester combatants. The through line in the examples above is obvious. The American police are not trying to de-escalate urban conflict, but to provoke and dominate their opponents. They're not attempting to keep the peace. They're fighting to, quote, win, unquote. This list is inevitably missing many flagrant aspects of violence by the police against protesters that happened between Sunday night and Thursday morning. It's hard to keep up. It's hard to know where to train your gaze. The only thing we can say for certain is that the United States is witnessing nothing less than a nationwide police riot. And that's been my impression, too, from seeing all the clips that I've seen. So, next, I'll remember to share the screen for this one. And this would be from Common Dreams and Jake Johnson. Please ignore the thunder. It just started storming here. Quote, this isn't going away. Defying curfews and police brutality and relentless push for justice, uprising over killing of George Floyd keeps growing. Okay, this was a dispatch today, June 4th, by Jake Johnson, again in Common Dreams. And it just reports on the tens of thousands of people demanding justice for the police killing of George Floyd and so many others. And people took to the streets across the U.S. once more today in a powerful signal that the nationwide uprising is only growing in the face of repression. There was a video of thousands of demonstrators lying on their backs in D.C. near Freedom Plaza, just 2 days after law enforcement viciously attacked peaceful protesters gathered at the White House. This led Washington Post, the Washington Post reporter Melissa Lang to remark that, quote, the crowds keep getting bigger, unquote, even as President Donald Trump ramps up the street presence of the military, the FBI, ICE, and the Border Patrol. Quote, said Lang, well, maybe it's Kang, I don't know, one place it's Kang, okay, another place it's Wang. Sorry, it's Lang. Quote, there are more people at this die-in right now than there were in front of the White House, but yesterday, she tweeted, quote again, and more yesterday than the day before. And Clarence Williams tweeted, thousands of demonstrators lie prone near Freedom Plaza shouting, I can't breathe. What was true in D.C., what was true in major cities and small towns across the U.S. There was a tweet from G, okay, and Ursula at G, at G, at Ursula Show. Small town protests are growing in Everett, Lacana, Bellingham, Olympia, and she goes on with approximately 10 other small cities and towns in the state, okay, of Washington. And then she has a picture, okay, of Linwood tonight. And it wasn't quite I guess that was in the evening, okay, of last night. But it's spreading all across America, is the point. In Oakland, California, thousands of demonstrators chanting "Our Streets" defied the mayor's 8 p.m. curfew and rallied at City Hall on Wednesday night, demanding an end to police brutality and racial injustice. Thousands also gathered in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Brooklyn, New York, Seattle, Washington, Detroit, Michigan, and New Orleans, Louisiana. And we all need to stand up for each other. We can't be silenced, quote unquote. Oakland resident Ava Kravitz told NBC, quote, it's our right to be here, to speak, so we have to do that. Okay? We have to be here. So again, usually the brutality is also a violation of the constitutional rights of free speech free assembly and or free press that is supposed to be the rights of all the citizens of the United States, guaranteed by the Constitution. So the police and the governments that are backing them and that are ordering them in sometimes are violating the Constitution. Why don't we have penalties for violating the Constitution? We have penalties when there are violations of laws, but when there's wholesale violations of the Constitution, people, for some reason, are never prosecuted just for that. Why not? We need laws establishing that. We need to make people pay for violating our constitutional rights. Here's video of peaceful New Yorkers being attacked by the NYPD tonight. Police charged at them. That was the night of the 3rd, of course. Police charged at them on bikes from behind and without warning. They were slammed onto the ground and then apprehended for flouting curfew. But of course, not everyone was arrested. I was unharmed, reports Fred at Wayward by Winifred. That was June 4th. It might have been tonight. Tweet. Anyway, Fred said, I only managed to help one young woman escape arrest. This next video was filmed by by Gamoji. He was in the melee, but also escaped arrest. I met him while we were both taking shelter, in the lobby of a co-op. And there's a video there for that. And so this again goes into the violations of constitutional rights going on across the country. In a tweet on Wednesday night, Jayapal echoed the common sentiment that the charges are a direct result of the nationwide protests and urged people to keep up the pressure of the charges, that is, in Minnesota. In other words, the fact that there were 3 more charges of 3 more of the people complicit in the murder of George Floyd. To those rising up, speaking out, organizing together. This would not have happened without you, said Jayapal. Quote, keep marching, keep protesting, keep demanding accountability, and keep fighting for justice. Don't stop building the pressure necessary to secure change, unquote. Of course, I endorse that, but I want to add to it. Keep fighting for your constitutional rights. What has happened over the last 20 years is that our governments, federal, state, and local governments, have been collaborating in depriving us of our constitutional rights of freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and freedom of press. They've done it routinely. They've done it in cities across America, in protest after protest, in G7 protests, in World Bank protests, in Occupy Wall Street protests. And of course, in these latest protests. But generally speaking, whenever people get out and protest, there are the cops. They're generally depriving us of our constitutional rights. They are never there to protect the protesters. They are never there simply to keep order. They are there to create disorder and conflict and civil strife and to punish people for exercising their constitutional rights. So, if we don't keep on marching, keep on protesting, and keep on demanding accountability, and keep fighting for justice, then we will be giving up our constitutional rights to their coercion. What they're doing is gradually imposing tyranny upon us. States, okay, and governments that operate without crucial civil liberties like free speech and free press, okay, and freedom of assembly, those especially, those governments are tyrannies, because there is nothing in them to prevent tyrants from imposing their will on all of the rest of us. What were the grievances against King George? What were the grievances that were mentioned when the United States asserted, okay, its independence, when the country became independent? Free speech, free assembly, and free press were among the most important of the rights that had been violated by the king and by his authorities. And it was that assertion of tyranny that was some of the primary reasons why the colonists took the step of asserting their independence. Now, there are many other reasons, and I know that there are various reasons for thinking that the prime reason for rebellion was so that a large number of colonists would be able to retain their slaves. I'm quite well aware of that. But the fact is that we don't credit that reason as a legitimate reason for declaring independence in 1776. But we do all agree that the violations of free speech and free press, okay, and free assembly were signal violations of a tyranny. And we all agree that what we want is down with tyranny. And we want to keep tyranny down. Always. Always and everywhere. We Americans are supposed to be opposed to tyranny. That's what the denial of free speech and free press and free assembly is. Without those freedoms, we wouldn't even have begun to get the right to vote. And those freedoms lie at the basis of the right to vote, and lie at the basis of freedom of conscience and the other freedoms we enjoy too. The right to be able to get out on the streets and to publicly protest and to hold governments accountable and authorities accountable and police forces accountable. Those are rights we can never give up and still be a democracy. And those are rights we have been giving up, in fact. Those are rights we've been allowing to slip away. We haven't been fully addressing the issues. Yes, we object to brutality. And we object to violation of civil rights. And we object to oppression of people but due to race. But we have not been saying, quite simply and to the point, that the basic foundational rights of our democracy are being violated when we go out to protest injustices of various kinds, and the police turn against us as if we are the enemy. Police forces like that deserve to be defunded and disbanded, because they do not protect and they do not serve. They do not do what they're supposed to do. Okay, next is an article in Common Dreams by Owen Higgins. Ilhan Omar, criminal justice reform bills offer systemic solutions to systemic problems, quote unquote. And that was an article from today as well. Yes, from Common Dreams. And Ilhan Omar announced her intention to introduce a legislative package aimed at overhauling the nation's criminal justice system. She is really a wonderful lawmaker. She is a treasure. Absolutely a treasure. There's a picture of her at 38th in Chicago. I think that must be in Minneapolis, 38th in Chicago, but Lana can tell us. Anyway, the legislation would provide overarching support for the victims of long-standing. I find myself not sharing that, so let me go back and share the screen. So there we go. Here's the picture, okay, of Ilhan Omar at 38th in Chicago. Okay, that's from a tweet by Alex Hagan. And the article says, okay, the legislation would provide overarching support for the victims of longstanding and ongoing police violence, and are intended to offer solutions for the deep-seated institutional racism that dominates our policing. The suite also includes a rebuke of President Donald Trump's threats to use the Insurrection Act against protesters. The package consists of four separate bills. The National Police the Police Misuse of Force Investigation Board Act, co-led by Representatives Ayanna Presley of Massachusetts and Sheila Jackson Lee, okay, a Democrat, okay, of California. I thought Sheila Jackson Lee was from Texas, but correct me if I'm wrong. Forming a federal commission to investigate police killings around the nation. Perhaps it wasn't Sheila Jackson Lee. Okay, it could be Barbara Lee of California. I think there's a mistake there. Anyway, the bill to criminalize police violence against protesters, which allows for the charging of police officers who attack protesters to be charged with a federal crime. That bill is sorely needed, but at the same time, it's dependent on having a president and an attorney general who will enforce that law. If we had that law in place right now, I don't know whether it would do any good. It would really depend on the willingness of the FBI to charge the police officers. The Amending the Insurrection Act, co-led by Mark Pocan, who's a Democrat from Wisconsin, and Pramila Jayapal. And there she is again, Jayapal. Jayapal is like almost everywhere, isn't she? Preventing the president from deploying the U.S. military against the protesters. I think she's a treasure, too. And the Federal Relief Fund, providing funding for communities rebuilding after social and economic disasters. Something that could be used for Minneapolis right now. Ilhan Omar said in closing, quote, "We need systemic solutions to systemic problems, and those closest to the pain must be closest to the solutions," said Omar. And then a piece from Truth Out. I don't want to go through this whole piece, though it's a good one. Okay, it's by my favorite author over there. Okay, who's William Rivers Pitt, the editor. The article is, as Trump wages war on D.C. residents, it's clear he must resign immediately. Okay, this is an op-ed, of course, and it was written today. So Pitt says, if the noises coming out of usually silent the U.S. military circles are any indication at all, however, we are at this moment teetering on the verge of a domestic military conflagration unseen in all of the history of the United States. He points out that our capital is an occupied space. He points out that federal agents from the FBI, the ATF, Defense Department, the Customs, and Border Protection, Homeland Security, Bureau of Prisons, and other agencies, all in riot gear, and some without identification, have swarmed around the White House, as well as around some of the monuments that are popular, such as the Lincoln Memorial. By late Wednesday morning, many of the streets around the White House were closed to traffic and so on. And then he invokes the anniversary of the authoritarian Chinese government crackdown in the crackdown in Tiananmen Square in 1988. Washington, D.C. is an armed camp bristling with war weapons, its residents the only enemy in sight. It stands as an unmistakable advertisement for what Trump would like to do in cities all across the country, especially the ones in states with governors who are Democrats. Invest them with soldiers, smash the protests that inconvenience his re-election campaign, and strike fear into the hearts of the citizenry. A few more quotes, Kay, that I wanted to give you here. He goes through Mark Esper, the Defense Department, going back and forth seeming at one point to defy Trump and then folding. He pointedly told the assembled press that he did not support invoking the Insurrection Act. Esper is the Secretary of Defense, if I forgot to mention that, and said matters in the country had not risen to a crisis point that required the intervention of the military. Coming from a man in his position, this was a remarkable public rebuke. And it was. But Esper was metaphorically walloped with a White House candelabra as soon as he walked back into the building, which apparently explains why he abruptly reversed an earlier order to remove active duty troops from the 82nd Airborne Division from their position just outside the city. So he reversed, an order. But after he did, Army Secretary Ryan McCarthy joined Esper in saying the situation has not risen to the dire necessity of using soldiers against the population. Quote, "It is our intent at this point not to bring in active forces," he said to the Associated Press. Quote, "We don't need them at this point." Then on Wednesday afternoon, the grim news cycle was stampeded by the former Defense Secretary James Mattis, also known as by his nickname, which is actually Mad Dog Mattis. He resigned from Trump's cabinet in 2018 to protest the president's harebrained policies in Syria. And Pitt says, "You won't ever find me calling Mattis a hero on these pages." And after the carnage he unleashed on Fallujah while in command there. That being said, his words on Wednesday rang with a hard truth this nation and the world needed to hear. When I joined the military some 50 years ago, I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution. Never did I dream the troops taking that same oath would be ordered under any circumstance to violate the constitutional rights of their fellow citizens, much less to provide a bizarre photo op for the elected commander-in-chief with military leadership standing alongside. Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without a mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. This will not be easy, as the last few days have shown. But we owe it to our fellow citizens, to past generations that bled to defend our promise, and to our children, and might I add, to our grandchildren. Less reported, but far more ominous, was a letter dispatched on Tuesday by Army General Army General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to the leaders of all branches of the military. Quote, "Every member of the U.S. military swears an oath to support and defend the Constitution and the values embedded within it," wrote General Milley. Quote, "Please remind all of our troops and leaders that we will uphold the values of our nation and operate consistent with the national laws and our own high standards of conduct at all times, unquote. The only reason why I can think of why a military leader of Milley's high rank would dispatch a public letter to the leadership of all branches in the military, asking them to remember their oath to the Constitution, is because he expects Trump to order them to break that oath. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, with this letter, appears to have thrown down a marker at the president's feet. Such an order will not be obeyed. Boy, I hope that Pitt is right. If it comes to that, if Trump gives that order and the military refuses to comply, we will have a civil war between the civilian leadership and the armed forces, which could in turn lead to a civil war within the ranks of these forces. In the midst of a pandemic and with police continuing to actively attack peaceful protesters, such a turn of events would splinter and shatter an already fractured nation. For the good of the country, for the good of the people, Donald Trump must resign. His fellow Republicans, who are the only ones at this point able to exert any effective pressure upon him, must rise from their docile slumber and convince the man that his time is over. President Nixon only resigned after Barry Goldwater informed him he had lost all meaningful support in Congress. So now Mitch McConnell must do likewise, right now, today, before there is more blood running in the streets. Don't get me wrong. I don't expect this turn of events to transpire. But if there ever was a time for it, it's now. But President Mike Pence, it's an utterly gruesome alternative, given his far-right Christian but dominionist views. However, President Pence would be significantly immobilized, much as Gerald Ford was after Nixon split town. While one of the main impediments to properly addressing the COVID-19 pandemic would be removed. We're on the brink. If Trump does not depart the office he has so thoroughly despoiled, I fear 2021 will make the horrors of 2020 seem like a garden party by comparison. Of all the bad choices arrayed before us, this is one of the better ones, which tells you all you need to know about where we stand. So, I completely agree, of course, with that call for the resignation, of Donald Trump. I'm all for that. I'm 50,000% for that call for the resignation of Trump, and for the call for the Republicans to go see him and tell him to be gone, that he can no longer play with the United States, that he can no longer be the president of the United States. But simply apart from that, we the people cannot allow our basic freedoms to be further eroded. So we must, as Jayapal has said, we must keep on protesting. We must keep the pressure on, not only in relation to demanding justice for George Floyd, not only in demanding justice for all the black people who have been murdered, but also in demanding justice for all of those who've had their constitutional rights violated by our governments at all levels and by the police, who are supposed to be there to protect and to serve us. I know that's a cliche. In other words, everybody is saying that now and giving you that particular cliche. But the cliche is relevant. The police are there to protect us and protect our constitutional rights. And instead, they wholesale violate our rights. We must stop them now from doing that. And afterwards, we must be eternally vigilant the minute that authorities try that again. The rights of free speech and free assembly and free press must be inviolable in the future of the United States. They must be inviolable. We must fight for them. We must never stop fighting for them, because they ultimately are the difference between a place that may become a democracy, that may become an open society, and a place that is simply a tyranny. So on to your comments. Kay says, the Movement for a People's Party call was a very good call tonight. Sandy greets Steve. Steve greets Sandy. Sandy greets Kay. Dale says, hello, Sandy. Avril says, more clear-headed. Finally got some sleep, but still can't get my balance and eyes to coordinate. I'm glad you finally got some sleep. That's really important. That's the first step in getting back your balance and your eyes to coordinate. And Carmen says, I wonder if the world can understand why we can't protest as literally as they can, because of the cruel police brutality, and abuses, even killing, that we face at the hands of our police. There are, a very large number of nations of the world also have that situation. We don't have the only police who are brutal and who are killers. But if we look at those nations that claim to be democracies and that we have considered our peer nations in this particular respect, there are very few police killings in those countries. In the UK last year, there were only 3 police killings. Here in the United States, there were thousands. Kay says, I saw the video of that in Asheville. Disgusting. Avril says, I need for Michelle to come give me a massage. Gina says, why didn't the police act this way during Trump's Liberate protests, where the assholes occupied government buildings holding guns? Probably because many of those assholes were policemen from elsewhere who came to the protests. Kay says, Asheville used to be a hippie haven in western North Carolina. No more, I guess. Dale says, they're essentially wiping their asses with the Constitution. This is tragic. Avril says, correction, they can. Steve says, this is what happens when you militarize police. Yes, it is. But even before we militarized the police, they were violent and they were killing people. And all we did is to place the whole thing on steroids when we militarized them. Avril says, Christ on a cracker. This is heart-wrenching. Avril says, watching news. Healthcare workers show support for protests. Yeah, the healthcare workers on their way home are getting brutalized by the police. T says in Mayberry, RFD, Andy and Barney Fife were filmed beating the shit out of a pregnant black woman. Oh, God. Avril says sadists are out of the closet to feed on the supply of pain and agony. And once again, who can we turn to? We are the ones we've been waiting for, folks. We can turn to ourselves. It has to be mutual aid. Kay says fascism has been the operative word all over online on the news today. And he even hit Chris Hayes' show on MSNBC tonight. Well, it was on the Morning Joe and Mika show this morning. Okay, and it was on Nicole, what's her last name? I guess, okay, it's Wallace now. She was talking fascism too. They're worried about fascism. Avril says, all this reminds me of Rwanda. Evelina Pont says, one woman in a peaceful protest in New York was arrested with something like 100 people said they were lectured about taking resources away from the looters because they were violating the curfew. Taking resources away from the looters. Oh, because they were, oh, I see. From taking care of the looters. By their violating the curfew, they made things easier for the looters. So they were lectured about that. Sure. In other words, they went after peaceful protesters and not the looters. Right, right. Russ says, nationwide police riot. You bet. And Steve says, wonder how this is being taken internationally. It's being taken very badly internationally with all kinds of criticisms of the United States. However, Trump doesn't care about that. And the police thugs do not care about that. And the state and local governments generally do not care about that. They don't care about what people in England think about us, what people in Germany think about us. They just don't care because for them, America is the center of the world. And there is no other place. And they love to boast about how democratic we are as they're beating up on all of us. Avril says, accuse the other side of that which you are guilty of. Police throwing the rocks and hiding their hands behind their backs and blaming protesters for it. And Russ says, it might be a global police riot. Why? Is there a police riot in France right now? Is there a police riot, okay, in the UK right now? I doubt it. There might be a police riot in Brazil or in Chile. They seem to specialize in police riots down there. Evelina says, oh, she also said they were an hour to an hour and a half into the curfew. So it must have been between 9 and 9:30 p.m. They were at the tail end of a huge march. Yes, I'm sure. Cuomo thinks uttering such things about the Popo is heresy. The mainstream was fine with all of the police violations that had taken place over the years. They were fine with all of the violations of free speech, okay, and free press. They were fine with the persecution, okay, of Julian Assange and the persecution of other journalists, okay, and other whistleblowers. They weren't so hot about the free press, okay, at this point. Maybe, just maybe, these protests have brought home to them that their own reporters can be brutalized by the police, that their own employees can be brutalized by the police, that they can't get their stories because they're being brutalized by the police. So maybe these damned wealthy corporations will finally do something about defending freedom of the press. I hope so, because their behavior has been scandalous. It's been corrupt. It's been reprehensible. It's been gutless. And it's been witless. They should have been on the dime right from the start. They don't make any noise at all. They should be running editorials on every damn mainstream station and in every newspaper in the country and every magazine, condemning the police countrywide for their actions. Kay says, I was very proud to see that my granddaughter and hubby were participating in a small protest in New Haven, Michigan today. That is north of the Detroit area. I hope the police are friendly there, Kay. Avril says, I guess the white allied protesters are getting a taste of what I'm sorry, I've forgotten what POC is. Okay, I remembered yesterday, but I'm sure you'll remind me. Not that I think they deserve it, however. I hope it rattles their entitled families. Avril says suppression of speech. In a way, Judge Sojourn said, agreed. I recall Occupy well. Sandy Degg says shared. Yes, Occupy. When was Occupy? It was during the administration of that great defender of free speech and free press, Barack Obama. And guess what? Obama's administration collaborated with state governors and with local mayors in democratic cities across the country to repress the Occupy movement. Isn't that what happened? Obama's Department of Homeland Security collaborated in the repression of the Occupy movement and in the repression of other protests as well at various times across the country, setting a precedent for Donald Trump, getting people used to the idea that our police could routinely deny the rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Okay? And the federal government would do nothing to stop them. In fact, it would help them as long as it brought an end to the protests, as long as protesting for justice departed from the scene, because that way the rich could be protected from the pitchforks. And Charles Lovett says, good evening, everyone. Sorry for checking in late. Thank you, Dr. Joe, for teaching and sharing. Thank you for coming, Charles. Always nice to see you. Alvaro says, I hope Bajayapal is marching too, potentially getting injured as those who are on the front lines are, so she really feels the oppression. She used to march in protests. She's a democratic socialist, and she was very active in the Seattle protests. I don't know if she ever got injured, but I'm sure she's experienced what was going on in those particular protests. Okay, says Obama helped kill the Occupy protests. He certainly did. And DAPL. Absolutely, Steve Wolfbrandt. And DAPL. And Alvaro said, yes, Dr. Joe, tyranny is upon us. So who will help? The military? If it comes to that, it helps greatly if the military refuses to order the troops into battle against us. That will help, okay, a great deal. That may well convince the cabinet to use the 25th Amendment to displace Donald Trump. And once they do that, and once it falls to the Congress to ratify that, I think that with the military in back of that, you will suddenly see the Republican senators starting to desert Donald Trump. They're not going to defend him as the last institution to stand in the way of his fall from the presidency. That is not mentioned in the Truth Out article by Pitt. But if the military leaders decide they will have nothing to do with violating the Constitution, and they simply sit down and they order their soldiers to stay at the forts and not to obey the president, within a day or two, that crisis will probably cause the invocation of the 25th Amendment by the cabinet. Certainly, some of those cabinet members are going to be in favor of it. Perhaps a majority. If Pence is willing to go that way, as he may be willing to do, you might get an invoking of the 25th Amendment. It would help if Nancy Pelosi throws in another impeachment for these actions. And Kay says, yes, and did nothing to help the poor people of Flint when they poisoned their water. Absolutely, Kay. And Steve says, I worked on Occupy LA every day. And Judge Sojourn says, the freedom of assembly and press in great peril now. He says, yes, yes. Thank you for doing that, Steve. Thank you for doing that, Steve. I appreciate it very much. Romano says, unfortunately, a tangerine tyrant is in office. I don't care whether his color is a tangerine or pure black. It's the tyrant that counts. Kay says, we're getting back all the injustices that we invade other countries for doing. It's true, Kay. Steve says, the people assembled to protest police brutality. The police come out and beat the shit out of the protesters. Yes. How dare you protest our brutality? We're going to give you some. See how you like it. Evelina says Bernie wants them defunded. He said so today. There's an article in Counterpunch calling for the defunding as well. It's by Alex Vital. Is it in Counterpunch? No, I think it's in Jacobin. Sorry. It's in Jacobin. Judd Sojourn said, I agree so very much, and it seems so badly needed to be said. Averill said, well, they serve and protect themselves and corporations gain industries. Right. So they all need to be fired because they're supposed to be protecting us. Judd said, Ilhan, yes. Love, love, love. And Mustafa says, Kate Clark Ryan, well said. Sandy Degg says she's a treasure. Judd says, a bright soul. Averill says, being of light. Is our only hope General Mattis? Well, General Mattis is retired now. So he's not in the Defense Department at this time. He's not on the Joint Chiefs at this time. But it may be Mark Milley. But he's probably influenced by Mattis, who was a predecessor of his, and he probably knows very well. Kay says at least the General Mattis is speaking out. Not many have his guts. That's true. And Averill says, "What's up with Rand and his obstruction to make hanging a high crime? Is he closet Klan too? Well, he's a senator from Tennessee. Lots of closet Klan people there, especially in the southern part of the state, where people were migrating continuously from Memphis between 1950 and 1990. I don't know whether migration from Memphis has stopped, but I'm sorry. In Memphis, Tennessee, they were migrating into Memphis from Mississippi. And that's what was going on. Got that wrong. Had to straighten it out. And Kay says, and Pelosi is doing nada. Yeah, she's busy eating her designer ice creams from her freezer. I wonder if she has a big freezer in her office in the house. Averill says he must have powerful backers, connections. I think so. Kay says not closeted. Averill. Averill says the drunk skunk is somewhere polishing her overpriced freezers and crying into her gourmet ice cream because she's out of liquor and can't make it to ABC Liquor to buy more because of protesters and police. No, today she was out. She was out for long enough to endorse by Eliot Engel, who's getting a challenge in Congress in the district just over from Ocasio-Cortez's 14th congressional district, in New York. In the next district over, Eliot Engel is being challenged by Jamal Jamal Bowman, who's a very progressive candidate, a very good candidate. He's been a school teacher and I think a school principal, as well. But giving a very strong challenge, to Engel, I think, is a good chance, that Engel is going to lose. And Bowman has the endorsement of Ocasio-Cortez. So Engel just got, the endorsement, of Nancy Pelosi. So there they are, directly conflicting in the district just next door to Ocasio-Cortez's. In Beverly Hills yesterday, says Steve by Wolfbrand, they started chanting, eat the rich. Maybe they're figuring it out. Kay says, I think so too, Steve. Averill says, eat the Congress. Stacy says, Mattis is not brave, nor does he have guts. He's a POS glory hound. No real man would hold a his political views or sit on criticism because of norms. Steve says, if you're going to eat ice cream, eat Ben, okay, and Jerry's. She won't eat Ben and Jerry's because they contribute to Bernie's campaign. Okay, and Ben Cohn was co-chair. Ivor Manos says, excuse me, who was the guy from...
You mentioned it. Where is he standing?
Oh, I see.
Canada?
The guy from the Bush administration? Sorry, which guy from the Bush administration?
I think he was captain or something, and he, black man. Anyway, I can't remember his name, so it doesn't help.
Okay, we'll talk about this afterwards. I'm not sure who you mean. You may have been waiting for Colin Powell to say something.
Yes,
You mean Colin Powell?
Coleman.
He was the chairperson of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was a
heard.
military hero.
Yeah, we haven't heard anything.
He was also
from him.
Secretary of State.
We haven't
No,
heard anything.
we haven't heard anything from Colin Powell yet. I wonder what he's doing. Though we have heard from his chief of staff, okay, Larry Wilkerson. Colonel Wilkerson, as usual, has been out front and very explicit in his condemnation, okay, of Trump and in his worry over the onset, okay, of fascism before the United States. I wonder if Colin Powell can be far behind. Avril says we need the military to corral the police. Evelina says, I tend to agree with you about General Mattis. Avril says, curious if any of the MMTists are protesting alongside holding hashtag learn MMT, hashtag end neoliberalism, hashtag austerity is murder, hashtag insist signs. Kay says, haven't seen any, Avril, they need to. Stacy says, looks like Seattle has troops in full desert theater, but desert, it's riot gear, folks, deployed. Sorry about that. People who need indisputable ammo. Evelina says that would be fabulous. And Avril says, agree. Adolf Twitler needs to go to hell, but Project Blitz, religious nationalists will become very powerful under Pence. No, they won't, because Pence won't have too many months to make them powerful. Avril asks, Colin Powell, okay, is still alive? I think he certainly is. Stacy says, Colin Powell is a liar. He may be a liar, but he has certain characteristics that mean we might well hear from him. Avril says, Bonnie favors Jamie Curtis. Who is Jamie Curtis? Are you thinking of Jamie Lee Curtis? Okay. Any other comments? Any other comments? I'm sorry I was having a little more trouble with my speech tonight. Okay, but yesterday and also today, I've just been very, very angry. And that's one of the ways in which it comes out. Sometimes it comes out in rants, and sometimes it comes out in stutters. And I'm just very, very, very angry. Anyway. So, any other comments or questions? All I have to say is keep fighting. Yes, Jamie Lee. Sorry, she has smiling eyes. Yes, she does. And she smiles a lot, too. And Russell says, yep, when you. And Rob says, you missed my comment. I'm sorry, Rob. Okay, I didn't see it. Judd says, your stutter is comforting. Thank you, Judd. Kay says, thank you for another discussion. We're all angry, Joe. Yeah, I know. We are all angry. Judd Sojourn says, much love and respect. And thank you, Judd. Jamie Curtis is a hermaphrodite. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Steve Wolfbrat, you're a riot. And Rob Rivera, when did you say something? We're all angry with you, Joe. It's heartbreaking to watch these images around the country, Andy Eid said. It is heartbreaking to watch these images. Okay, what comment of yours did I miss, Rob? I apologize for missing the comment. I certainly wasn't trying to miss it. I will try to recover it now. New Blackwater She type firms will sprout. And Judith Van Ryzen says, I didn't realize she was so young. Who's she? Stacy Van Veen says, POS. No, I wasn't asking about the POS. I know what POS means. I saw POC. I was wondering whether that meant piece of cheese. The police are damaging the neoliberal wage slaves. One 17-year-old black girl had the guts to film a murder for 8 minutes and set a country on fire. She's traumatized, but she changed the world. That's very true. Private message shortly after Dr. Joe is done. Well, Rob says, the irony of the media taking fascism in the right context because they don't feel safe anymore. The media cried wolf for so long, lying, misleading, causing mass confusion, engage in pro-war propaganda campaigns, and emotionally manipulating people that they woke up and now don't trust you or take you seriously. That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And Judith J. Van Ryzen says, private message that is shortly after Joe F. is done. And Judith says, check out the Tim Black show about 10:15 Central Time. Yeah, I watch Tim Black myself. Judd Sojourn said, that is so sad and true. They just don't care because of them. America's the center of the world. There's no other place. Yeah, I did miss your comment, but I think I picked it up now. My favorite part is comments with Joe. Evelina Pont, she's... Judd Sojourn says, I'm also worried about fascism. And Jude J. Van Ryzen says, Evelina Pont, he's no neoliberal. He's a neoliberal. The average American won't get anything from Biden. I completely agree. Steve says, best part of the show. And Stacy says, Kelton was designated as the chief economist for the Democratic minority staff on the Senate Budget Committee. The judge said, I've never heard anyone read and respond to comments. It's very human. Jamal Thomas often will read and respond to comments. Evelina Pont says, oh, I missed that. And Avril says, Bernie still spewed, not speeded. We are autocorrect. The name of the committee was the Budget Committee. And before he was the ranking member of the Budget Committee, he was the chair of the Budget Committee. And for just a few months, he appointed Stephanie to be the chief economist of the majority on the Senate Budget Committee. And she was that for a while, for 3 months or so. But then the Republicans took over the Senate, and so Bernie was the ranking member, okay, of the Budget Committee then. And so then she became the chief economist, but for the minority. And somebody remarked, I know I didn't miss a comment that somebody said that but Stephanie Kelton has been advising Bernie since 2015. I think actually before that, what Bernie did was to appoint, a committee of economic advisors. What was it called again? He had some name for it, like the Super Magic Committee, or the, I don't know, but it was a grand name. And Stephanie originally was appointed to that. A lot of other good people were on that, but Tim Canova was on that. Jamie Galbraith, was on that, and I think was responsible for Stephanie's getting on it. But Randy Ray was on that, as well, and Bill Black was on that. 4 people who knew MMT very, very well were on that, and Tim Canova was favorable to MMT. Also on that were his committee of super economists had Jeffrey Sachs on it and Robert Reich as well. And I think also Bob Parlin, if I'm not mistaken, at the University of Massachusetts, at Amherst. And I believe Gerald Friedman. It had 2 or 3 people from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, as well. So the UMass and Amherst School of Democratic Socialism was represented, on that committee, and the MMT group was 4 people on the committee. I think altogether there were 12 members of the committee, and that's where Stephanie first got to serve Bernie Sanders. When he lost his chief economist on the budget committee, in other words, they developed a vacancy in the fall of, I believe, 2014. And so he needed a new chief economist. And that's when Stephanie signed on. Now, at that time, Stephanie was not really too well known to him, but Bernie has known Jamie Galbraith for quite a long time, because Jamie has a farm up in Vermont, and he spends some time every summer up there. So one of the first people Bernie would have called, to get another economist to come on to serve as the chief economist, on the budget committee, would have been Jamie Galbraith. And then Jamie most probably suggested that Bernie go to Stephanie and see if she was available, because he has been a sponsor of Stephanie's for some time. I found out about this in 2010 and realized that he was pushing her into certain things. He got her involved in Economists for Peace and Security, in a big way. And when he left as, I don't know, I forget what the title is there, director or chair, or president of the Economists for Peace and Security, Stephanie became his successor in that particular position. So they've been close for years and have appeared on panels together very, very frequently. Okay. But someone mentioned that Stephanie, is now an advisor to Joe Biden. I read today that Stephanie was advising the Biden campaign. I can well believe that, but don't be too enthusiastic about that, because that campaign is going to have a lot of advisors. Most probably Jared Bernstein is going to be an advisor too, because he was Joe Biden's chief economist in the Obama administration. And when he was the chief economist there, Stephanie was lobbying him from outside of the Obama administration, and Jamie Galbraith was too. They both were lobbying him. Stephanie struck up a friendship with Jared. At least, I won't say a friendship, but she became rather friendly. But Stephanie is a very, very personable person. She's very nice to people. She's kind, and she's very nice to talk to. And while she always sticks by her position and she teaches people, what she believes, she always does that in a very personable and non-threatening way. And I think that she and Jared have become frequent communicants over a period of years. And so since Jared was the chief economist for Joe Biden, in the Obama administration, and has probably remained close to Joe Biden since then, one of the top economists for Joe Biden, if he becomes the president during his campaign, is going to be Jared Bernstein. And so Joe would go to Jared Bernstein and ask for suggestions as to who are some of the other economists whose views he ought to get. And so Stephanie would be suggested by Jared as one of the economists he ought to consult, and especially because her consulting with Joe Biden would be something that would please Bernie Sanders, at this point. So that's a key point, certainly, of linkage, because Bernie is very high on Stephanie, of course. She, has been advising him now since, well, as I said, I think the advice first began at some level in 2012 or 2013. But lately, through both of his campaigns, she's been someone that he could trust. And he has trusted her, and he talks to her a lot, and she's a senior fellow, okay, at the Sanders Institute as well. So she's been a big part of his thing for some time, okay, and so to have her talking a lot to Joe Biden is something he would favor because she's going to put some good ideas in for consideration by Joe Biden. And maybe she can serve as a useful counterweight to Larry Summers. In fact, the very game that Jared Bernstein could be playing here, since he knows Larry Summers has the ear of Joe Biden too, but Jared Bernstein doesn't really agree with Larry Summers. Jared would be looking for a counterweight to Larry Summers, who would be persuasive and who would be convincing and who could give Joe Biden counter arguments. And then that would leave it open for Jared to serve as the person who decides who's right, Larry Summers or Stephanie Kelton. Jared would find some way to split the difference and at least get some of the good ideas of Stephanie Kelton in there. That's the way I think things are going to go if Joe Biden becomes the president. I think Stephanie is going to have some say, but there will be very powerful people serving as a counterweight to Stephanie. And she'll win a few arguments, but she's going to lose a few arguments as well. Okay, so I got to look and see if I missed any other comments. Sorry, I didn't realize I missed a few way back there. Sometimes the feed going through my software plays a few tricks on me. That people are still protesting is a good sign after all these days. I hope they continue through this weekend, says Ivo. Me too. Steve says, yes, she live streamed again from the memorial at the site of the murder. She was very distraught. She'll be traumatized for many years. A hero, yes, she sure is. Judd said, I had that same thought that the military might actually defy an order to go into battle against civilians. I've had that thought, too, for some time. I don't know what they're going to do. They take an oath to the Constitution, and they get educated in the doctrine that the civilian leadership is, they're supposed to be serving, okay, the civilian leadership, but they also get indoctrinated in the idea that they serve the Constitution. All the good people in the military feel that way. There are some exceptions. Okay, I'm not going to mention who I think, but they are. But there are not so many exceptions. Even some of them who are conservative when it comes to politics, okay, from a political point of view, they know that it's their duty to defend the Constitution of the United States. And they take an oath, okay, to defend it. What kind of military leaders do we have, though? Pompeo is a trash monster that excelled at West Point. He's nothing but Opus Dei, scare trailer scum. Right, but I don't think he rose too high in the military hierarchy. Did he, Stacy? Kay says Rand Paul is from Kentucky. Oh, yes, he is. I'm sorry, yes. He is from Kentucky. You are right, Kay. I got that wrong. I forgot. Okay, Alana says they followed Elvis from Mississippi to Memphis. Yeah, they did. They were the people, okay, from Mississippi, white people, okay, from Mississippi, started to migrate north to Memphis, and they changed the political complexion of Tennessee, which for a long time was very New Dealish, okay, in its orientation, and is somewhat soft when it came to segregation during the 1950s when Estes Kefauver was the senator from there. He was very soft when it came to segregation, kind of a closet integrationist, and he was quite liberal in most other ways. And he was the vice presidential candidate for Adlai Stevenson in 1956. And then there was Al Gore's father. Okay, he was a senator from Tennessee, and also Senator Clement. But first, he was the governor of Tennessee, but Governor Clement, Earl Clement, and then later he was the senator from Tennessee. So Tennessee had senators who self-identified, okay, as liberals for a long time. I think that first changed when Alexander became the senator, okay, from Tennessee. But he was the most right-wing senator they had, okay, in a very long time. And then Gore, of course, okay, was beaten. And, okay, I shouldn't say beaten, but, he stepped up to the vice presidency. And then the state went completely over to the Republicans. But it used to be a Democratic state. It used to be a Democratic state. And it wasn't a bourbon state, where the upper class ran the state. It was more democratic, okay, than that. And very devoted to public power, okay, and to the New Deal. All this is a digression, though. Into the politics of long ago, when I was young. Avril says, so the longer the protests, the better. To some degree, it depends on how the protests actually develop and what the reaction is to the protests as time goes on. And Avril says, I bet that red wine ice cream would be tasty. I don't know. I never tasted it. Avril said Colin Powell's still alive. And Colin Powell is a liar. Bonnie favors Jamie Curtis. You missed my comment. Your stutter is comforting. And thank you, Judge. Andy Eade says, which of Stephanie's ideas could Biden adopt? Well, Jared Bernstein, and Dean Baker have written a book that advocates for the job guarantee. Now, it is not the MMT job guarantee that they were advocating for. But of course, but Stephanie has probably had a lot of conversation with Jared Bernstein concerning the job guarantee, and undoubtedly has read his book and has suggested ways in which his job guarantee program could be made better. But Joe Biden's probably been hearing about Jared Bernstein's job guarantee program for some time. So maybe Stephanie could get Jared to embellish the job guarantee in certain critical ways so that it would look more like the MMT job guarantee, which, if only that was adopted, that would be a wonderful thing. The other idea, though, of course, is going to be what Stephanie has to say in her book, which is coming out a few days. The book, okay, on the myth of the deficit. That book is likely to make a big splash, and Biden will become aware of it and will become aware that it's going to the top of the economics charts. Hopefully, it will go further than that. Okay, then if it does, Stephanie will be even more famous, okay, than she is now. And then when Biden brings her views to Joe Biden, they will probably be much more respected. If Stephanie can get Joe Biden off the fiscal responsibility kick, that would be so very important. If she could get him not to worry so much about the deficit and inflation and the whole idea of fiscal responsibility, because he really needs to do that. In other words, Joe Biden needs to accept the Green New Deal and to really put that through if he becomes the president of the United States. And by the way, there's a DNC committee on climate change, that just released a report early today. The DNC's own committee, comprised of climate experts that the DNC appointed for itself. And those climate experts came out with a report suggesting that what the Democrats needed to run on and what they needed to pursue and what Joe Biden ought to adopt is a $16 trillion over 10-year Green New Deal plan. If I recall correctly, they even suggested something similar to Bernie Sanders' Green New Deal plan. So the DNC's own committee is telling Joe Biden that his plan was not going to do the trick. On the other hand, if Joe Biden is going to pursue a $16 trillion plan, then Joe Biden has got to give up the idea of not running deficits. He's going to have to run some deficits in order to fund $1.6 trillion a year on the average spent on a Green New Deal program. And Rob says, I'm not so trusting of the military. Will they not shoot Americans? Yes, but only Americans. The soldiers deem acceptable as an American. I mean, look at their All Lives Matter argument. They say all lives matter, and based on their own context, they're contradicting themselves because they see and know they abuse, okay, and know the abuse against black people and say nothing. All lives matter. All lives matter is code for some lives matter. We just aren't going to say publicly which ones do not matter. The fact remains that one of the most integrated places in our society when it comes to racial integration is the military. That's been the case since the 1940s. And I do think that most of the military people who've been, okay, on overseas duties accept the idea that those people of color who fought alongside of them overseas are Americans whose lives actually matter. And I trust the military to act in that way because I've known a lot of military people informally. I lived in the Washington area for a long time, and I was always meeting military people. And I got to talk to them, okay, in informal settings. And I have to say that they didn't appear to have any problems with the blacks in the military. They just did not. Even Southerners had become fairly well accommodated to the blacks who served alongside of them. They were much better than the civilians in this respect. What I don't trust about them is the tendency of their authoritarian notions and ideas to spill over to politics. Now, I think a bulwark against that has been that they've been trained to be as non-political as possible over the years. And that may serve to counter that. But certainly all their training in the military is authoritarian training. But the kind of authoritarian they favor, I don't think is the Trump type. I mean, Trump, okay, to them, must seem very chaotic and very undisciplined and very arbitrary, and not like the better military men that they've known inside of the armed forces. Andy Eade says, I watched an extremely powerful live stream from the front line in front of the White House last night as a veteran walked up and down the line of National Guard soldiers, showing them his credentials and yelling at them, reminding them that this isn't what they signed up for. I bet that was powerful. And Steve Wolfbrand says, sing us out with Les Miserables. Officials or soldiers? Both laugh out loud, says Sandy Degg. And Steve Wolfbrand says Biden is hopeless. And Georgia official says shoot to kill protesters. Yeah, Georgia state is run by a fucking Trumpist. And Georgia official says police should shoot to kill George Floyd protesters if they continue. That's awful. Avro says yes, and the military folks are very close. Steve says not the 40s of Vietnam. Avro says racism isn't encouraged at all in the military because of the morale. Yeah, I think that's true. I think it's true. Okay, so Steve asked, I always forget, is it can you hear the people sing or do you hear the people sing? Do you hear the people sing? Singing the song of angry men. It's the music of a people who will not be slaves again. I can't sing too much of that because I think it's a violation of copyright or something. I haven't checked that. But anyway. So there you are. The song from Les Mis. Thank you, everybody, and good night. The Song of Angry Men. Exactly. Can you do Woody Guthrie? This land is your land, this land is my land. From California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream water. This land was made for you and me.
Didn't
Good night.